Chapter 2 The Watcher. Sandra stood in front of the old chapel. As she looked around, she noticed that the chapel was once a fine-looking piece, but now was a mess. It was crumbled. There was no roof, apart from its wooden foundations. The right side of the building was missing a huge chunk out of the wall, and so was the front. Out front there were gravestones plotted around the place, and a cart lay near the chapel filled with bodies. The bodies obviously belonged to those who had died from the sickness going around. She then went to the gate on the opposite side of the chapel. She opened the gate and closed it behind her. When Sandris arrived at the foundry, she was on rooftop. As she looked around, she noticed that there were a lot of guards in the main yard. There were also 2 cages, both with vicious dogs in them. Sandris noticed that a bridge was suspended over a concrete drop about 6 meters deep. In the drop was a ladder that led up to an open vent. Open? Garrett must have gone in that way, Sandris said to herself. Sandris then saw a rope hanging from a wooden plank above her. This confirmed her thoughts. Sandris reached for the rope and slid down into the drop. As she walked along the base, she noticed that the ground was covered in ash. In the ash were footprints. Sandris followed them and discovered that they led to the vent. Sandris climbed the ladder and crept into the vent. The vent was made of metal. It was cold and dark, with a few red lights at the end. As Sandris crept through the vent, she carefully and slowly placed her limbs out in front of her. Once Sandris had reached the end, she climbed out. She realized that she was in a room that had some iron bars near the top of the wall to her left, which made it possible to see into the yard with the guards and their hounds. Sandris went into a kneeling position, surveying a map that she had been given of the area. As she did so, she noticed a secret tunnel that led to the center of the building. Great. An incinerary room. This map says that's where they're taking all the bodies to loot and then burn. Better look there. Garrett would probably head that way. Better take that passage. It'll keep me clear of guards and hounds. Sandris crept through the secret tunnel. It was dark, cold, and had rats running around inside. Once she got to the end, she noticed that it led to under the flooring of the incinerary room. The room had 2 tables near its center facing horizontally towards the incineraries. Sandris looked through the iron bars. They made up the majority of the floor above her. She suddenly heard a footstep above her and a tapping sort of sound. A walking stick? Sandris heard a voice. What did this body have on it? Sandris recognized the voice. It was a harsh, cruel voice that had no respect. It belonged to the thief-taker general. No, sir. This body had nothing on it. The guard sounded young, around 18 or 19 possibly. Are you sure? And with that, he grabbed the hand of the young soldier and picked up a meat cleaver. Then he put it into the young man's hand and guided it into the dead corpse's stomach. The harsh man let go of the nauseated guard's hand and picked up the ring that had been digested. If you want it done, do it yourself. And with that, he shot the young soldier in the neck with his wrist bow. Sandris's gut felt sick. She had never felt this way before. She had dealt with and seen dead bodies before. But this? Her body was fighting against her. It wanted to scream, and she was fighting to keep her mouth shut. Then, from nowhere, she felt a sudden grip reach over her mouth. Her arms were immediately pinned, and her legs swept out from under her. Silently, she hit the ground. Sandris was already shaken from the events that had just occurred, and now this. She bravely looked her opposer in the eyes. One of them was light blue, the other brown. She quickly scanned the attacker's torso. The figure's face was concealed by a fabric cloak and mask. They wore a black leather outfit with a brown harness and several straps attached to it. As she recognized the figure, Sandra began to relax, her heart still pumping. Once confident that she wouldn't make a sound, they let her go. Sandra stayed laying on the floor, still trying to process just what had happened. When her stomach no longer felt sick, she slowly sat up and faced the man. "See that Basso still insists on you watching me." The voice was grim, cold and harsh, but not as harsh as the general's had been. Sanders looked down at the floor in front of her. She didn't know what to say to the thief, and so she just nodded. Garrett was shaking his head. "Why Basso keeps insisting that she watches me is ridiculous. He's been doing this for about 3 years, and I doubt that'll be changing soon." Garrett knew that she was now 16, considering the age she had been found by Basso. He had once found another thief to teach her, but this one had ended up being cruel to Sandras, giving her scars and wounds that didn't fade away. Basso had then asked Garrett to teach her, but he had declined. "Okay. Well, while you're here, I guess you can tag along and help out." His voice was neither harsh nor friendly. Sanders looked at him, a newfound light glistening within her eye. But that was quickly extinguished when she quickly remembered what had happened when she worked with the other thief. The thief who had taught her was named Vagor. Vagor had gone missing shortly after he had mortally injured Sandras. No one had ever seen him since that day, 4 years ago. Garrett knew this secret about her, and he put a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, let's get this ring for Basso." Garrett headed up a staircase that led to the incendiary area. The thief-taker general had left to put the ring in another room. Garrett swept between the 2 tables in their shadows as the incinerator's doors closed. Sanders followed in his path, but took longer to get to the other side than him, waiting for the shadows to appear, disappear, then reappear a few times until she was confident that she had memorized the pattern. They then snuck through a vent which led into the room where the general had stored his ring. Once Garrett was at the end of the vent, he held up his hand, warning Sanders to stop. So she did instantly, with no objections. Garrett assumed that this was because of her old teacher. Garrett entered the room, checking it before he called upon his temporary companion. He signaled her to join him, and Sanders appeared behind him. "Keep an eye on the door. Inform me if someone is coming towards this room." Garrett's voice was serious. "All right, I'll keep an eye out." This was the first thing Sanders had said to him. Her voice was somewhat cold, and she seemed anxious. Sanders walked silently towards the door. Garrett noticed that her left leg made a faint sound. Garrett watched her left leg as she walked, and eventually saw a limp. Odd. Why does she have a limp? I don't remember her ever having one. Garrett shook the idea to the back of his mind. He'd return to it later. Garrett then turned his attention to a lock that was more a puzzle than anything. When did a lock ever keep him from getting what he wanted? As Garrett worked on opening the lock, Sanders kept watch through the keyhole. Suddenly, she bolted upright and silently ran over to Garrett. "The general is coming." Sanders' tone was nervous. She had heard stories of the man. Horrible ones. She had seen what he had done to his men, and she feared him. "Okay, see that door in the corner? Start getting it unlocked." His tone was quiet and serious. He knew how Sanders felt. He could see the fear forming in her two-toned eyes. Sanders just did as she was bade without answering. "Once you open it, start heading back to Stone Market, and don't wait for me." Sanders hesitated once she opened the door, but then she heard the door where Garrett was standing unlock. She quickly turned around and saw him pick up a chair and force it out in front of himself like a shield. A sudden thud rang throughout the room, and Sanders saw a crossbow bolt embed itself within the chair. She watched as Garrett smashed the arm of the general's against the doorframe before kicking him out of the room and slamming the door, using the chair as a barricade. Sandras froze with some unknown fear. Garrett quickly ran to the door where Sandras was and put his hand on her shoulder. "Come on, before this place becomes riddled with guards and hounds." His tone was urgent. Sandras suddenly focused and started to run after him, following Garrett, copying his actions and making sure that she didn't misplace her feet or balance. Once they had reached the rooftops, they looked back at the foundry. They both saw the area swarming with guards and hounds. Alarms rang throughout the night. Sandras looked up at Garrett for a brief second, then down at the tile of the roof. She felt horrible. She had disobeyed him. She was a weight, holding him back. Garrett saw that she looked miserable and guilty, with a hint of fear in her features. It was obvious to him that if she had have done this with her previous master, she would have received a beating. Garrett noticed that she was also holding her arm. Garrett quickly grabbed the arm she was holding and scanned her quickly. A sudden shake and cry of fear emanated from her body, and she tensed up. She was attempting to break free of the grip her companion held on her. Sandras hadn't felt like this in years, and now that it was back, the thought of being beaten terrified her. Her gaze met Garrett's, but as she looked into his eyes, her body's tensing receded. His eyes held no sign of aggression towards her, nor any thoughts of hostility. She looked away, tears rolling down her face. She had reacted like she would have with her old master. Sandras's body remembered the brutality that had been taken out on her when her old teacher had failed at getting something that he required. He would blame her, and he blamed her in his own way. He beat her. He had caused her to become more concealed than she originally was when Garrett had first met her at Basso's store. Garrett noticed her actions, and he was concerned. He knew that her master would beat her, but to make someone suddenly change from being relaxed to becoming terrified and helpless, that was wrong. Garrett found a wound on her arm, and he reached for his pouch. She began to become nervous until Garrett looked down at her with a genuine smile. "It's okay. I'm just going to patch you up." As he finished speaking, he pulled out a bandage and started to wrap it around her wound. Sandra stared up at him. Why was he helping her? Why this sudden change in his approach to her? She didn't know, and she knew she probably would never know.